Chinul's Thought by Robert E. Buswell, Jr. From Introduction, The Life and Thought of Chinul in Tracing Back the Radiance, Chinul's Korean Way of Zen. Syncretism. The first 2 centuries of Buddhism's development in its Indian homeland saw a fairly consistent approach to the original corpus of Scripture. Although contending schools did flourish, they looked for inspiration to a common stratum of Agama material and were distinguished as much by differences in Vinaya interpretations as by controversies over the central issues of Buddhist practice and ideology. After 500 years, new sutras began appearing in the south and northwest of the subcontinent, which expanded upon and eventually challenged the authority of the early texts, fostering an increasing divergence in scriptural interpretation. The tenets of these new sutras, which came to provide the foundation for Mahayana theology, were often difficult to reconcile with traditional doctrine and engendered considerable controversy between new progressive sects, which found their inspiration in these texts, and the conservative elements of the Sangha, which regarded them as heterodox. The Mahayana movement is commonly assumed to have developed out of the orientation found in certain later schools of the early church to minister to the needs of secular adherents of the religion rather than primarily to its monastic followers. The Proto-Mahayana progressive sects proved to be more adaptable in dealing with the individual needs of their followers, as well as more flexible in responding to differences in social conditions. These inclinations, coupled with the vast quantity of new scriptural material becoming available, made the Mahayana schools quite eclectic in their presentation of doctrine. They did not hesitate to incorporate elements of the folk traditions and popular religious rituals that they encountered, reinterpreting them always from a Buddhist perspective. Consequently, Mahayana Buddhism came to flourish over a wide area of India and demonstrated a unique ability to take root in new cultures where other religious traditions were already well established. Over the centuries, the development of schools devoted to particular sections of this later canon, combined with the inherent eclecticism of the Mahayana ecclesia, led to a remarkable diversity in Buddhist thought, as well as increased factionalism within Mahayana itself. The introduction of Buddhism into China corresponded with this period of sectarian development on the Indian subcontinent and in Central Asia, and China itself rapidly developed sectarian traditions. The vastness of the country and the large size of the Sangha allowed various sects to coexist on a scale probably unsurpassed even in India. In China, too, up through the middle of the Tang dynasty, Buddhism was gradually reinterpreted in light of native religious perspectives. This process of adaptation culminated in the development of Chan, a system of Buddhist thought and practice which molded the Indian worldview, still inherently alien to China, with Chinese modes of thought. For a people which found the intricate exegeses of the scholastic schools difficult to assimilate, the Chan school proposed a simple yet potent approach to Buddhism that eschewed theory in favor of practice. From the time of Chan's ascendancy, Chinese Buddhism was repeatedly to exhibit a tendency toward 2 extremes, either excessive emphasis on scriptural research or rejection of the utility of the sutras with emphasis on formal practice. During the golden age of Buddhism in China, from the Sui dynasty to the Huichang persecution of 842 to 845, this sectarian atmosphere prevailed, and a broad diversity of doctrinal outlooks flourished. Even during this period, however, Chinese Buddhist theoreticians became increasingly concerned with finding some common denominators among the different schools of thought. That is, discovering an inclusive approach to harmonize the conflicting interpretations of these schools, as well as to reconcile the often incongruous tenets of the different strata of the sutras themselves. Besides the need to introduce some consistency into the broad divergence of Mahayana doctrines, this new syncretic movement also responded to the vision of a unified church which had become fragmented during its cyclical periods of political disfavor and clerical degeneracy. Although syncretism had already been adumbrated in major Mahayana scriptures like the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, the Indian preoccupation with religious polemics and sectarian debate had vitiated its systematic investigation, as well as the application of the syncretic principle in practice. It was Chinese Buddhist philosophers who first developed the theoretical framework upon which syncretism could be realized. The writings of the Tiantai founder Zhi Yi, 538 to 597, the Huayan systematizers Fa Zhang, 643 to 712, and Cheng Quan, 738 to 840, and Chan theoreticians like Zhongmei, 780 to 841, and Yan Shou, 904 to 975, all explored the harmonization of Buddhist doctrine and practice from the standpoint of their own sectarian proclivities. Zheng Guan and Zhongmei both made attempts to demonstrate the correspondences between Chan and Huayan, the representative schools of the two major approaches to Buddhism, practice, and theory, but neither was able to go beyond the recognition of correspondences to an explicit effort to merge the two sects either doctrinally or practically. Fa-Yen Wen-Yi, 885 to 958, and Yan Shou employed Huayan analogies to explicate the truths of Chan, and many Chan monks advocated the reconciliation of the Chan and scholastic schools, but the dissociation of the two major schools was maintained up to the 13th century, when syncretism finally became the predominant tendency within most sectors of the Chinese Sangha. Korea was one of the last countries in East Asia to inherit the Buddhist teachings, and it received them in a highly developed and prolix form. The vast numbers of sects which formed in Chinese Buddhism led to attempts to find in these various approaches to Dharma, each ostensibly Buddhist, yet each so different, some common denominator through which their disparate elements could be incorporated. The flourishing of Buddhism in Korea during the unified Silla period coincided with a rapid acceleration of these investigations in China. Ultimately, most major Korean Buddhist theoreticians were influenced by these efforts, and their works established syncretism as the predominant theme of the Korean doctrinal outlook. Certain circumstances peculiar to Korea also strengthened the tendency toward syncretism. The small size of both the country itself and its monk population simply did not allow a split into large numbers of contending factions. Furthermore, the continual threat of foreign invasion and the often unstable political atmosphere created the need for a unified, centrally controlled ecclesiastical institution. Although the vision of a church unified both doctrinally and institutionally had inspired Buddhist theoreticians in China, the first establishment of the interdenominational Buddhism which had eluded the Tang theoreticians and their confreres came in Korea, with Chinul and his successors. Living in the middle of the Koryo dynasty, Chinul was faced with a fully developed church showing serious signs of moral and spiritual decline. A major split had occurred between the scholastic and Son sects, a split exacerbated by increasingly inflammatory and intransigent attitudes among adherents of both schools. Drawing inspiration from his vision of the basic unity of Son and the sutras, Chinul developed an approach to Buddhism in which the theoretical aids of the scholastic doctrine, particularly as presented in Li Tongxuan's interpretation of Huayan philosophy, could be used to support Son epistemological and soteriological views, especially as outlined in the Hotse school of Chan. This unique combination can, with little exaggeration, be considered the most distinctive Korean contribution to Buddhist thought. There was also a personal consideration which prompted Chinul's accommodating attitude toward the scholastic schools. Chinul was first and foremost a Son adherent, but certainly not of the same pedigree as Matsu Tao-yi, 709 to 788, or Linji Yixuan, died 866. He was, of course, ordained into the Son lineage of Sagul-san, which was traditionally assumed to descend from the Nanyue line of southern Chan, and passed his Sangha entrance examinations in the Son sector, not the sutras. Nevertheless, Chinul did not study formally under a Son master for any extended period of time, and never received transmission from a recognized teacher in the tradition, and is one of the few important Korean masters who was never stimulated by a pilgrimage to the Chinese mainland. He was compelled to look for his information and spiritual guidance to the only authentic source available to him: the sutras, commentaries, and records of the Chan masters, which were collected in the Tripitaka. For this reason, from early on in his vocation, he developed a natural eclecticism and did not hesitate to borrow from the teachings of the scriptures if he found them helpful. Throughout his life, Chinul owed his progress and all of his enlightenment experiences to insights gained from passages in the canon. Indeed, it is difficult to conceive that he could have denied their value as a tool in spiritual cultivation. Chinul's view of the Chan schools. Western accounts of Chan have been dominated by descriptions of the 5 schools into which the mature tradition of the late Tang and early Sung dynasties was divided: Linji, Caotung, Yunmen, Fa-Yen, and Kuei-Yang. It was through these schools that Chan emerged as a distinctly Chinese school of Buddhism with a viable doctrine and practice. Until the systematization of the Chan teachings, however, there was considerable experimentation among the immediate followers of the early teachers. Experimentation concerning not only expedient methods of meditation, but the underlying epistemological foundations of the Chan Dharma itself. This is the period of Middle Chan, dating roughly from the early 8th to middle 9th centuries. Although little literature remains from the teachers of this period, the traditionally recognized fifth patriarch of both the Huayan and Hotze schools, Kuei-feng Tsong-mi, 780 to 841, has left a considerable amount of interpretive material concerning the various approaches to Chan in his day. In his notes to the Great Commentary on the Complete Enlightenment Sutra, Tsong-mi discusses 7 major schools which were popular during this period, and there are passing references to still other schools in some of his other works. 4 of these schools, which are representative of the approaches current in other Chan schools, are singled out for detailed treatment in his portrayal of the successorship in the Chinese Chan school which transmits the mind ground. The Northern School, the Niutu School, the Hongzhou School, and the Hotze School. Chinul was greatly influenced by Tsong-mi's analyses of the various Chan schools, and he closely examined these same schools himself in his magnum opus, Excerpts from the Dharma Collection and Special Practice Record with Personal Notes, a commentary on the immediately preceding work of Tsong-mi, unknown as titled in China. His analysis, however, differs in several respects from Tsong-mi's. Tsong-mi was the last exponent in China of the Hotze school, and his critiques of the other schools were consequently distinctly colored by his sectarian affiliation. Although Chinul generally favors the Hotze approach, he is not nearly so critical of the other schools and finds something of value in each of them. I will consider the details of their respective analyses later, but I would like first to examine the basic criteria employed in the judgments of Tsong-mi and Chinul. According to their analyses, the teachings of the Hotze school offer uniquely a balanced approach toward first, Dharma, Pop, the nature of reality, covering the epistemological outlook of the Chan teaching, and second, person, in, the soteriological process followed in the spiritual development of the individual. Dharma refers to the 2 factors of immutability and adaptability. Person includes the 2 aspects of sudden awakening and gradual cultivation. Through the sudden awakening to the mind essence, the absolute immutable aspect of Dharma, a proper foundation is laid for the refinement of the phenomenal qualities innate to that essence via gradual cultivation of the myriads of bodhisattva practices. In such an approach, the absolute and phenomenal aspects of reality and the ultimate and conventional approaches to practice are kept in harmony, and consistent progress in spiritual development can be expected. Each school of Chan is weighed according to how well it emulates this ideal approach. It should be understood that Chinul's intent was not to give a historically valid description of the development of these 4 Chan schools, or the philosophical influences which shaped them. Indeed, in his day, such an attempt would have been impossible. Instead, Chinul takes each of the schools to represent an idealized approach to Chan theory and practice. Hence, his account does not deal with any of the multifaceted issues raised by the historical schools of the Middle Chan period. Rather, he treats basic attitudes toward practice which can be found in any era and any group of practitioners, including the Son adherents of his own time. Our knowledge of the Middle Chan period is developing rapidly, and it would be presumptuous of me to attempt a comprehensive treatment of the era here. I will limit myself, therefore, to the briefest of historical descriptions in order to bring the schools into focus, and then turn to Tsong-mi and Chinul's analysis of the virtues and weaknesses of their approaches to practice and enlightenment. In this way, we will gain some sense of the approach Chinul stresses in his own Son synthesis. The Northern School of Chan was founded by Shen Xu, 606 to 706, a prominent disciple of the fifth patriarch, Hung Zhen, 601 to 674. Shen Xu was a renowned Chan master of the 7th and 8th centuries and commanded a large following in both clerical and secular circles from the imperial capital at Luoyang in the north of China. Although later he was criticized by proponents of Huineng's sudden teachings in the south, most early Chan works recognize him as the legitimate successor to the fifth patriarch. The nature of his teachings have, in the main, to be ascertained from the admittedly biased accounts which appear in the polemical works of his opponents in the Southern School. Traditionally, Shen Xu is portrayed as having advocated a gradual approach to enlightenment, modeled along the lines of the Sutra teachings. All beings were considered to possess a luminous and monistic enlightened nature, which, in the ordinary person, is obscured by passions and bifurcated by dualistic tendencies of thought. Enlightenment is to be achieved by gradually cleansing the mind of these passions and thoughts until that nature is rediscovered and its inherent qualities are again able to manifest. After the ascension of the sudden approach to a position of orthodoxy in Chan, the gradual teachings of the Northern School were belittled by teachers in virtually all other schools of Chan. The critique of this school, which is given by Tsong-mi and accepted without reservation by Chinul in the Dharma Collection and Special Practice Record, is no exception. Because the gradual teachings center on the removal of essentially void passions and thoughts, its entire theory is compromised, for it substantiates the reality of conditionally arisen phenomena rather than recognizing that they come into existence through dependence on the absolute mind ground. By ignoring the immutable aspect of dharmas, the Northern school is attached to adaptability, the mundane characteristics of phenomena. Hence, by trying to counteract the defilements, it deals with them on their own terms, which further enmeshes the practitioner in their net. Although the school's counteractive practices are used at the stage of gradual cultivation as outlined in the Hotze school, and should therefore be acceptable, those practices are not based upon the initial sudden awakening, which would assure a proper outlook on the practice. Consequently, the adept cannot know that, although the defilements must be counteracted, there is nothing in reality to be counteracted, and no such practice to be performed. Finally, such relative practices only sustain the illusion that defilements do exist and must be counteracted, and that there is a practice which accomplishes this. With a theory and practice which are both incorrect, right enlightenment is, accordingly, impossible to achieve through this approach. Shenshu's teachings attracted considerable attention during his lifetime, and that of his principal disciple, Pu Qi. However, the virulent attacks of Shen Hui in the south, beginning in 732, severely undermined its influence. Finally, its location in the capital made it particularly vulnerable to political changes in the imperial court, and led to its enervation during the An Lushan rebellion of 755 to 756, and its eventual demise during the Huayan persecution of 842 to 845. Its influence over the later development of Chan, both in China and in Korea, was nil. After the fourth patriarch, Tao Xin, 580 to 651, had handed down his patriarchate to Hongzhen, he was traveling, according to legend, in the vicinity of Yudo, Oxhead Mountain, south of present-day Nanking, in Jiangsu province. Supposing that adepts of outstanding potential were hidden in that austere and isolated environment, he climbed up and discovered the monk Fa Zhong, 594 to 657, practicing in a rock cave near Yushi Monastery. After receiving instructions from Tao Xin, Fa Zhong was enlightened and received the transmission from the patriarch. Thus began one of the most successful of the early Chan schools, the Niutou, or Oxhead school, which lasted for at least 8 generations until the end of the 8th century. Before his conversion to Chan by Tao Xin, Fa Zhong had been an avid student of the Prajna Paramita texts, the tenets of which are centered on the ultimate voidness of all particularities. Even after the fourth patriarch had shown Fa Zhong that the absolute mind nature is originally enlightened and inherently endowed with all spiritual qualities, Fa Zhong's approach to Chan still was influenced by this early exposure to the doctrine of voidness, as can be clearly seen in Zongmi's synopsis of his teachings. The theory of the Niutou school was designed to point the way toward a vision of the essential voidness of all mundane and supra-mundane dharmas. Through this vision, the affairs of this world, which are commonly considered to be real, are exposed as the deluded hallucinations of the ignorant mind. It is by understanding the illusory nature of all affairs that the ability to abandon all attachments is gained. Once one realizes voidness, one can begin to overcome those defilements by relinquishing passions and desires and eventually transcend suffering. Zongmi's critique of this approach is based upon the school's emphasis on the immutable aspect of the dharmas, their voidness. Niutou simply recognizes that all qualities, whether mundane affairs or the supramundane experiences of nirvana or enlightenment, are essentially non-existent. For Zongmi, this is not a particularly encouraging vision. The dharma nature might be void, but it is also pure. It might be characterized by absolute immutability, but it also involves the adaptability of expedience. The Niutou teachings penetrate through falsity, but they do not reach the full realization, in which the dharma nature is seen to be the sum total of both immutability and adaptability. Consequently, as the school entirely neglects the positive role of the Buddha nature in promoting spiritual progress, it reaches only halfway to the approach of sudden awakening found in the Hotze school. From the standpoint of the gradual cultivation after awakening, however, its approach is acceptable because it stresses the cultivation of techniques which clear away defilements and maintain the essential calmness of the mind. Chinul is not quite so critical of Niutou and looks for another motive behind Zongmi's appraisal. Quoting a passage from Zongmi's preface to the Fountainhead of Chan collection, which says that the Niutou idea that everything is simply an illusion is not the only dharma of this school, Chinul surmises that Zongmi's reason for criticizing the school is to ensure that Chan students do not grasp at this voidness as being the only truth, but also move toward realization of the dynamic aspect of that void mind essence, the numinous awareness, Yongji, which is the original functioning of the self-nature. Hence, Nyoto's approach is a perfectly valid teaching which can be effective in enlightening people who obstinately grasp at dharmas as being real, the fault to which the northern school was subject. Furthermore, in combination with the positive teachings of the Hongzhou school, Nyoto's negative approach becomes a perfectly valid path to enlightenment, one that counters the tendency toward unrestraint and unlimited action, muihang, which is a typical fault of the idealist teachings of Hongzhou. Hence, in Chinul's view, the Nyoto approach is worthy of being retained as an expedient method of Song practice. Of the 7 schools of Middle Chan covered by Zongmi in his Yuan Jue Jingta Shu Chao, only one survived the Tang dynasty, the school of Hongzhou. Although there are no reliable sources through which to trace the history of this school's lineage, it traditionally is considered to have been founded by Nanyue Huaizhang, 677 to 744, an obscure disciple of Huayan, 638 to 713, the reputed 6th patriarch. The school was popularized, however, and its approach set by Huaizhang's renowned successor, Matsu Taoyi, 709 to 788, who is based at Kaiyuan Monastery in Hongzhou, a district in present-day Jiangxi. Since Matsu's disciple Pochang Huaihai, 720 to 814, another important figure in the school's early history, lived on Pochang Mountain. In the same region, the school which grew up around them came to be known as the Hongzhou School. Unlike the 3 other schools of Middle Chan covered in the Pochip Purhang Nok, the Hongzhou School was based in the south, far from the northern capitals of Luoyang and Chang'an. Because of its isolated rural location, it was able to avoid most of the periodic persecution suffered by all the schools based on the capitals. It was this school which developed the distinctive style of Chan practice that later became identified with Chan itself, the iconoclastic use of shouts, beatings, and paradox to give expression to the ultimate reality beyond all words and awaken its students into this state. Its teachings eventually branched into the Guiyang and Linji schools of the mature tradition, and its Linji lineage was the only direct transmission line of Chan to outlast the Tang dynasty in China. Although its unique approach to Chan eventually became the hallmark of the Chan Dharma, it should be remembered that at the time Zongmi was writing, the middle of the 9th century, it was still but one of many competing schools, and its approach had gained anything but widespread acceptance. The Hongzhou's approach to Dharma is portrayed by Zongmi as positive and idealist. It views all discriminative phenomena as manifestations of the non-dual Buddha nature. This Buddha nature embraces fully the absolute immutable characteristics of the mind, as well as its relative adaptable properties. Matsu's statement, "Mind is Buddha," signals this central conception. Awakening in this school means simply the understanding that all thoughts and discriminative activities are nothing other than the Buddha nature itself, and accordingly are all equally real. Shouting and the use of paradoxical expressions are expedients designed to expose directly to the student the reality of that nature. The view that all phenomena are manifestations of the Buddha nature allows the school to accept all things equally. But while this understanding brings it close to the Hōtse conception of sudden awakening, it ignores the differences between positive virtue and negative demerit, and thus is not as precise a formulation as is found in Hōtse. Moreover, there is one major inconsistency in its description of practice, which, for Zongmi, flaws the entire approach. It does not actively encourage further spiritual development after awakening, but holds that practice involves nothing more than keeping the mind in a completely receptive state, free to act naturally and spontaneously. Hence, rather than cultivating positive qualities or counteracting defilements, the student is simply to release the mind from all artificially imposed restraints and let it return to its fundamentally pure state. Once the Buddha mind is functioning freely, all the qualities and attributes which are inherently contained in that mind can then operate freely as well. The school represents, accordingly, a sudden awakening, sudden cultivation approach to practice, in contrast to the sudden gradual approach of the Hōtse school, which Zongmi considers to be most proper. As the Hongzhou school lacks any conception of gradual cultivation, it is inferior to the Hōtse school. This controversy over sudden and gradual awakening and cultivation is discussed more fully below. Chinul, writing nearly 4 centuries after Zongmi, is of course aware of the eventual success of the Nanyue lineage in establishing Chan solidly in China. He is aware also of the extinction of the Hōtse line immediately following its brief respite under Zongmi's leadership. He is therefore considerably more lenient with the Hongzhou approach. Although he, like Zongmi, supports the basic approach of the Hōtse school, he finds that the Hongzhou school also presents a fully viable approach to Son practice. Indeed, quoting from another of Zongmi's works, preface to the Fountainhead of Chan collection, he goes so far as to say that they are the same school, implying thereby that even though the Hōtse lineage died out in China, its teachings lived on in the guise of the Hongzhou school. Chinul demonstrates that the Hongzhou teachings are an effective means for perfecting the ultimate instrument of any meditation practice, thoughtlessness, or no mind. If, through thoughtlessness, the student can maintain the awareness that all things are void, he cannot be trapped by either good or evil dharmas. Consequently, his practice and understanding will be irreproachable. Chinul assumes that the reason for Zongmi's criticism of this school stems not from the inherent inferiority of its approach, but rather from two fears. First, adepts might become attached to an insouciant attitude encouraged by the school's idealist outlook. Since all things are innately true and are completely indistinguishable from the noumenal Buddha nature, there is nothing which needs to be cultivated, for everything is perfected already. This assumption that everything is essentially the same could hinder the mental faculty which distinguishes the wholesome from the unwholesome. Second, students might end up grasping only at verbal descriptions of the Buddha nature, effectively blocking their ability to awaken personally to that nature. In Chinul's view, the Hongzhou teachings contain valuable expedients for the development of practice. Their positive character is, moreover, a perfect complement to the negative tendencies of the Newtou teachings. They ensure that the Chan student does not fall into the error of cessation, that is, taking all things as being nothing but voidness. Hence they are especially useful in dealing with a mistake all too common among Chan adepts, attachment to the mental calmness which comes with practice, rather than going forward to develop the dynamic qualities immanent in the mind. Throughout the first quarter of the 8th century, the northern school of Chan retained considerable spiritual and temporal influence in the northern Tang capitals. In 732, however, a relatively unknown monk from the south of China launched a grand assault on the Chan of Shen Shu's successor, Pu Qi. Advocating a sudden approach to Chan which supposedly derived from the truly orthodox transmission of the patriarchs, he eventually triumphed over all the other schools of his time and established his own as the legitimate lineage of the Chan patriarchs. It thus became the dominant school of Chan in the capitals. The initiator of this new movement was the monk Shen Hui, 670 to 762, a reputed disciple of Huineng, one of the fifth patriarch's 11 main disciples. Challenging the northern school with the enthusiasm of the true prophet, Shen Hui made accusations about the northern school's doctrine and the legitimacy of its lineage which sometimes approached hyperbole and fabrication. By retelling the history of the Chan transmission, he established his teacher, Huineng, as the sixth patriarch, and to confirm that the northern school's gradual approach was a blatant misconstruction of the true teachings of Chan, he produced a collection of sermons by his teacher which vindicated the sudden doctrine of the patriarchal lineage. This sudden teaching assumed that, since the mind nature is always complete and perfect in itself, systematic development of the mind prior to enlightenment through expedient methods of practice is utterly redundant. What is required instead is the sudden awakening to that nature, which automatically assures that its operation becomes unimpaired. Although there is no guarantee that a similar doctrine was not in fact advocated by the northern school as well, its branding as an inferior gradual teaching which had usurped the rightful teachings of the patriarchs placed it immediately in a defensive position from which it never recovered. By 745, Shen Hui had attracted enough attention to warrant an invitation to reside in a monastery within the precincts of Luoyang itself. Undoubtedly, the wider audience there increased the tone of his invective. Unable to ignore the continued attacks of Shen Hui, coming then at such close range, the northern school took action. Their political position gained through long years of imperial favor enabled them to convince important officials that Shen Hui's motives were subversive. In 753, he was exiled to the remote province of Jiangxi. The exile was to be short-lived. The Anlushan rebellion of 755 to 756 created havoc in the capitals and placed considerable financial strain on the meager resources of the exiled government. To raise money for its military campaigns, the Tang administration set up ordination platforms throughout the country at which monk certificates were sold. After the capital was recovered, Shen Hui was called back to Luoyang to assist in this money-raising campaign, and his efforts were so successful that the government was considerably strengthened. In recognition of his success, the government ordered that a Chan center be built for him on the site of Hōtse Monastery in Luoyang. Accordingly, the school he founded is called the Hōtse School. He remained there until his death in 762. The centers of the northern school were seriously disrupted during the rebellion and were never able to recover their former stature. Shen Hui's southern teachings had won the day. Although Shen Hui had been successful in his struggle with the northern school, his followers were not nearly so adept in maintaining his teachings. He had many disciples, but none achieved the renown of their teacher, and the school fell into gradual decline. Apart from a brief respite under its fifth patriarch, Kuei Feng Zongmi, its influence continued to dwindle until it finally disappeared in China during the Huizang persecution of 842 to 845. Zongmi, the last patriarch of the Hozi school, was one of the most incisive theoreticians in the Chan tradition, whose writings covered many areas of the scholastic teachings as well. His attempts to harmonize the views of the Chan and scholastic schools greatly influenced the future development of both Korean and Japanese Buddhism. Uisang had been impressed by Zongmi's balanced appraisal of the two systems, and Chinul incorporated Zongmi's thought, though not uncritically, in his own approach to the systematization of the teachings of Chan and the scholastic schools. Zongmi's presentation of the teachings of the Hozi school regards them as the basis of both the exoteric sutra teachings and the esoteric mind transmission of Son. They are consequently uniquely capable of absorbing all limited perspectives toward Dharma and practice held by schools of Buddhist thought. The theoretical suppositions of the Hozi school as they were interpreted by Zongmi center on the two aspects of mind nature, immutability and adaptability. The absolute basis of all dharmas is the void and calm mind. Although this mind is ultimately indescribable, it can be characterized from a relative standpoint through its original function, the inherent quality of numinous awareness. Whether the individual is enlightened or deluded, this awareness is unchanged either by the machinations of the discriminatory intellect or by the obscuring influence of external sense objects. Nevertheless, as this awareness cannot be limited or defiled by either internal mental and emotional states or by external sensory contacts, it is free to adapt in an infinite variety of ways depending on the individual's state of mind. If a person is deluded and immersed in sensual pleasures, this awareness adapts in such a manner that it is displayed as ignorance, karmic action, and finally suffering. But if a person is awakened, this awareness manifests in its basic void and calm guise. Hence, in Hozi's approach, awakening implies an understanding of these two aspects of the mind, its immutable absolute character and its adaptive relative faculties. In contrast to the other schools of Chan, discussed by Zongmi, only the Hozi approach is perfectly balanced between the immutable and adaptable aspects of Dharma. Through the sudden awakening to the void and calm mind essence, awareness is revealed in its fundamental form, free of thoughts and void of all relative signs. To maintain this state of thoughtlessness is the primary practice of the Hozi school according to Zongmi, and it is by maintaining this state that the remainder of the bodhisattva practices are brought to consummation. Thoughtlessness keeps the mind in a pure receptive state so that it can become gradually infused with the positive states of mind developed through various wholesome practices. It is through this gradual cultivation, which follows upon awakening, that the mind is filled with spiritual qualities which can be used for the student's own spiritual development as well as for instructing others. Accordingly, practice in the Hozi school cannot begin until there is sudden awakening to the mind and its immutable and adaptable functions. Through this awakening, the adept realizes that he is originally endowed with the nature which is no different from that of all Buddhas. In short, that he is potentially a fully enlightened Buddha already. With the understanding gained through this awakening, the student gradually cultivates the full range of wholesome qualities until Buddhahood is achieved in its active form as well. For full realization to occur, however, the symbiotic relationship between sudden awakening and gradual cultivation must be recognized, and their respective qualities carefully balanced. The awakening to the numinous awareness exposes the voidness of all phenomena. Based on that awakening, the student continues to cultivate the whole range of wholesome qualities, even though he has realized the essential voidness of those qualities. Thus he practices without believing there is really anything which is being practiced. Through continued cultivation, the obscuring operation of the defilements is overcome, and birth and death are transcended. At that point, the natural functioning of the numinous awareness is completely restored. The person is free to manifest in an infinite variety of ways the positive qualities which have thoroughly infused his mind, in order to help sentient beings of all levels and capacities. This perfect combination, the absolute calmness achieved through sudden awakening, and the dynamic responses gained through gradual cultivation, is the state of Buddhahood and the goal of all Buddhist training. Hence the approach of sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, the path which all the saints of the past have followed, is the optimum method for ensuring the ultimate attainment of Buddhahood for the ordinary Buddhist practitioner. Sudden awakening, gradual cultivation is the hallmark of the Hozi school and the ideal which distinguished it from other schools of Chan. Sudden awakening, gradual cultivation is as well the approach which is most easily reconcilable with the teachings of the Avatamsaka Sutra, the pinnacle of the scholastic doctrine. There, practice follows a process in which a sudden awakening to the Buddha mind at the entrance onto the bodhisattva path is followed by gradual cultivation until that Buddha mind is able to act freely, which is the final attainment of Buddhahood. By advocating sudden awakening, gradual cultivation in Chan as well, Tsongmi found a bridge between the scholastic and Chan sects. The Hōtse teachings emerge as an approach broad enough to embrace not only all other Chan schools, but all the scholastic sects as well. In Chinul's examination of the Hōtse school, he demonstrates that a combination of the diametrically opposed teachings of Hongzhou and Nyūtō results in the Hōtse outlook. Eventually, through understanding that ultimate outlook, all limited views drop away and a full vision of the true import of Chan is achieved. Tsongmi's interpretation of Hōtse practice places most of its stress on thoughtlessness. In Shen Hui's writings, however, there is an emphasis instead on the identity of samadhi and prajna. Samadhi, the calm, absolute aspect of the mind, means the non-arising of thoughts and correlates with Tsongmi's term thoughtlessness. Prajna, the dynamic analytical processes of the mind, refers to constant awareness of this non-arising of thoughts and the voidness of all phenomena. In passages which recall and often parallel sections in the Platform Sutra of Huayan, Shen Hui advocates that samadhi and prajna are two aspects of the same non-dual mind nature which cannot be differentiated absolutely. Samadhi is the essence of prajna. Prajna is the function of samadhi. Hence, these assimilative and dialectical abilities of the mind cannot be bifurcated, but should always operate in combination with one another. This theme receives detailed consideration in a number of Chinul's writings, especially Secrets on Cultivating the Mind and Encouragement to Practice. The Hōtse school did not last out the Tang dynasty. Indeed, Tsongmi's ecumenical approach, which to many Chan adepts seemed to blur the distinctions between the scholastic teachings and the special transmissions of Chan, gained him little but invective from Chan writers of later generations. The teachings which the Hōtse school had emphasized, the syncretic spirit, the sudden awakening gradual cultivation approach to practice, the balanced development of samadhi and prajna, inspired no lasting following within the Chan sect, and can be said to have exerted little influence over the further development of Chan in China. But 400 years later, in Korea, Tsongmi's writings found an ardent, though by no means uncritical, admirer in Chinul, who used them as the foundation upon which the epistemological suppositions of a uniquely Korean variety of Chan were constructed. It was this adoption of the teachings of an early school of Chan, and their use in bringing about a reconciliation between the Son and scholastic sects, which augured the whole future development of Buddhism in Korea. Chinul ensured that the Hōtse approach became a truly ecumenical teaching, and he broadened its scope so that it could encompass not only the Nyūtō and Hongzhou approaches of the early Chan tradition, but even the later Huayan and Linji teachings, the culminating achievements of the scholastic and Chan sects. Chinul's debt to Tsongmi is immense, and its ramifications will be brought out in the following pages. The Huayan teachings of Li Tongxuan and the rapprochement with Son. The rapprochement Chinul brought about in Korea between the scholastic schools and Son was based on his conviction that the message of the sutras and the special transmission of Son were essentially identical. To demonstrate this basic similarity, Chinul relied on the description of Chan practice given in the Hōtse school as outlined in the works of Tsongmi. To bring the scholastic schools into focus, he used the approach to practice detailed in the Avatamsaka Sutra, especially in the explication of Huayan teachings appearing in the exposition of the Avatamsaka Sutra by Li Tongxuan, 635 to 730. The Avatamsaka Sutra, a massive sourcebook of Mahayana Buddhism, was interpreted by its commentators in the Huayan school to give the most complete description of the bodhisattva path to Buddhahood appearing anywhere in the canon. 52 separate stages in the bodhisattva's development are outlined: 10 faiths, 10 abidings, 10 practices, 10 transferences, 10 bhumis, 1 equal enlightenment, and 1 sublime enlightenment. The account I give of them here is based on Li Tongxuan's exposition. The 10 faiths are, in a sense, a preliminary level prior to the entrance onto the bodhisattva path proper at the abiding stage of the arousing of the bodhicitta. Essentially, they involve developing faith that the fundamental nature of every sentient being is the Buddha of unmoving wisdom, and that this innate Buddhahood is endowed with 2 aspects, the noumenal essence and the phenomenal function. Although the bodhisattva's faith in these facts is strengthened at each of the 10 separate levels of faith, it is still based on intellectual and emotional acceptance, not direct personal experience. As Li says, the stage of faith reveals the fruition dharma and brings up cause and fruition simultaneously. But it merely catalyzes the arising of faith. It does not yet involve any real awakening. Direct experience of the reality of inherent Buddhahood is achieved through penetrating realization at the next stage, the 10 abidings. At the time of the first arousal of the bodhicitta, or thought of enlightenment, which occurs at the initial abiding stage, the bodhisattva realizes that he abides in the abiding place of the Buddhas, and has their same wisdom nature. This realization constitutes his formal initiation as a bodhisattva, and the true beginning of the path toward Buddhahood. At this point, the noumenal wisdom, the wisdom based upon the suchness of the Buddha nature's essence, is fully perfected, and the bodhisattva is endowed with all the qualities of Buddhahood in potential form. Although he might have realized that he is essentially a Buddha, it still remains for the bodhisattva to put that potential into action and make it function in fact as well as theory. This development begins at the next stage, the 10 practices. Based on the understanding that the original wisdom of Buddhahood is empty and simply such, the bodhisattva begins to cultivate the myriads of wholesome practices, without, however, giving rise to the thought that there is really something which is being practiced, or someone who is practicing it. Consequently, he can bring to perfection all expedient means of practice without falling into subject-object dualism, which would only further entrap him in the perceptual distortions that characterize the realm of samsara. At this stage, the bodhisattva begins to develop his phenomenal wisdom, the wisdom which is able to adapt to the ordinary world and to employ the things in that world for the benefit of other sentient beings. Up to this point on the path, there is still a dichotomy between the noumenal wisdom of suchness and the phenomenal wisdom of expedience. To ensure that such a false dichotomy is not maintained, which could cause either of those aspects of wisdom to ossify, the bodhisattva continues on to the development of the 10 transferences. At this level, the phenomenal practices developed in the stage of the 10 practices are merged with the noumenal understanding gained at the 10 abidings, bringing about the unimpeded interpenetration of noumenon and phenomenon. Through this merging, both the noumenal and phenomenal aspects of wisdom are free to operate independently and yet harmoniously. The culmination of the bodhisattva path is reached, and he enters the 10 bhumis. The 10 bhumis are the original foundation of all dharmas. Here the bodhisattva pervades all dharmas, all directions, and all positions simultaneously. Development before this stage involved some measure of effort, and entailed as well the progressive development of meritorious practices. By the time the bodhisattva has reached the 10 bhumis, however, he has nothing left to practice and nothing left to achieve. It is a kind of firming up stage at which all the qualities and achievements attained throughout the previous levels are matured and allowed to infuse his entire being. He merges with all dharmas without, however, losing his own identity in the process. This is the stage of the unimpeded interpenetration of all phenomena, the highest expression of spiritual attainment in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and by implication in all the Buddhist scriptures. Once the experience of this perfect interpenetration of all phenomena has been stabilized by passing through each of the 10 separate bhumis, the bodhisattva enters into Buddhahood itself at the equal enlightenment and sublime enlightenment stages. Equal connotes the noumenal perfection of Buddhahood. Sublime implies the perfection of phenomenal qualities. Both together signify the ultimate stage of Buddhahood. Here the fundamental wisdom of suchness and the discriminative wisdom of expedience are perfectly balanced. Compassion and wisdom operate simultaneously and in tandem. As a Buddha, the adept becomes one with all beings, again without losing his own identity in the process, and is accordingly supremely able to adapt to the unique needs of each and every individual. Li Tongxuan is an obscure figure in the early history of the Huayan school. His hagiographies have little to say about his life, although it is stated that he was related to the Tang imperial house. In 709, toward the end of his life, it is said that he took up residence in a hermitage on Fangshan outside of Peiping, and devoted himself to writing a number of Huayan exegetical works, including his magnum opus, a 40-fascicle commentary to Shikshananda's translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Best known during his lifetime for his thaumaturgic talents, Li's works initially had little influence on the development of the Huayan philosophical stance. Centuries after the orthodox Huayan school had ossified after the fifth and last of its patriarchs, Zongmi, Li's thought enjoyed the attention of teachers in other sects, particularly teachers in the Yangji lineage of the Sung Linji school of Chan. Li's works, transmitted during this period to Korea and Japan, exerted immense influence on the Buddhist traditions of those countries. Chinul himself was profoundly affected by his reading of Li Tongxuan's commentary, and through his advocacy, Li's thought assumed a central place in forging the Korean Buddhist doctrinal outlook. In Japan, Chinul's contemporary Koben, or Myoe Shonin, 1173 to 1232, was similarly impressed by Li Tongxuan, and Li became thereby an important influence in medieval Japanese Buddhist thought. And in China proper, Li enjoyed a resurgence of interest among both Ming and Jing Buddhist scholars, including the major Qing dynasty Huayan figure Peng Qi Qing, 1740 to 1796. Hence, from a position of all but total obscurity, Li Tongxuan's reputation rose until it finally eclipsed that of the orthodox Huayan patriarchs themselves. Li's contemporary Fa Zhang, the systematizer of orthodox Huayan doctrine, took the Avatamsaka Sutra's appearance of the Tathagata's chapter as the basis of his hermeneutical approach, and interpreted the sutra from a metaphysical standpoint, the philosophical implications of the Dharmadhātu theory. As such, his analyses of the sutra converge on the ultimate realization of the unimpeded interpenetration of all phenomena in the Dharmadhātu, also called the conditioned arising of the Dharmadhātu. Although it does not seem that Fa Zhang intended to commit himself inflexibly to a fixed temporal scheme as far as the development of practice is concerned, he does mention that, from a conventional standpoint, Buddhahood is attained through a process of learning, practice, and realization over a period of 3 lives. This process eventually culminates in the achievement of the unimpeded interpenetration of all phenomena. In contrast with this philosophical orientation, Li Tongxuan presented an approach to Huayan thought which is strongly practice-oriented. Unlike Fa Zhang, who concentrated on a description of the state of enlightenment, the realm of reality, or Dharmadhātu, Li's interpretation of the Avatamsaka Sutra centers on Sudana's personal realization of the Dharmadhātu, his pilgrimage in search of instruction so that he will be able to enter into the Dharmadhātu, as explained in the Ganda Vyuha chapter of the sutra. Li eschewed both the classical Yogacara computation, in which Buddhahood was achieved after arduous practice over 3 asamkhya kalpas, as well as Fa Zhang's theory of the attainment of Buddhahood over a period of 3 lives. Rather, he proposed the immediate achievement of Buddhahood in this very life, at the preliminary level of the 10 faiths. Li was able to justify this extraordinary claim by abandoning Fa Zhang's focus on the conditioned arising of the Dharmadhātu in favor of an approach based on the theory of the conditioned arising from the nature, or nature origination. In his treatise on the complete and sudden attainment of Buddhahood, Chinul's synopsis of Li Tongxuan's Huayan thought, Chinul gives a thorough analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the 2 theories, and comes out solidly in favor of nature origination as well, because of its presumed efficacy in bringing about direct realization in Buddhist students. Rather than working through a complicated series of theoretical instructions before attaining the final vision of the unimpeded interpenetration of all things, nature origination, in which all phenomena are seen to arise dependently from the non-dual true nature of suchness, provides the conceptual justification for Li's unique form of contemplation practice, the immediate vision of the identification of Buddhas and sentient beings. Li shows that the fundamental wisdom of Buddhahood in the ignorant, discriminative minds of sentient beings are originally of the same essence. It is only because of the arising of defilements and the processes of dualistic thought that a barrier has been erected between the 2 states. If a sentient being has a sudden awakening to the fact that his mind is innately free of defilement and is originally in full possession of the wisdom nature, then his relative mind and the absolute mind of Buddhahood will merge, and the fruition of Buddhahood at that very instant will be realized. Hence, for Li Tongxuan, Buddhahood is not something which results from the maturation of theoretical understanding. It is an inviolable fact, which requires merely the presence of an appropriate catalyst to prompt its recognition. Li Tongxuan's interpretation of Huayan doctrine was well suited for Chinul's attempt to demonstrate the correspondence between the Son and Hwaåm systems. In the Dharma collection and special practice record, and later in complete and sudden attainment of Buddhahood, Chinul shows that the terse formulas of Son, mind is Buddha, and see the nature and achieve Buddhahood, correspond respectively to Li's statements that the discriminative mind of sentient beings is the unmoving wisdom of the Buddha, and that the fullness of Buddhahood can be achieved suddenly at the initial entrance onto the Bodhisattva path. In this thinly disguised manner as well, Chinul correlates the Son emphasis on the pure nature with Li's stress on nature origination. Through such an approach, the massive metaphysics of Hwaåm philosophy was brought within the utilitarian outlook of the Korean Son schools. This was an incorporation which strengthened the theological foundations of Son while increasing the practical value of Hwaåm philosophy. Chinul also drew upon the terminology of the Hwaåm school to defend Son against the charges of heterodoxy made by the scholastic schools. He demonstrates in Complete and Sudden Attainment of Buddhahood that the awakening experience in Son is what the Hwaåm teachings term the sudden realization of the Dharmadhātu. This awakening is not the mere passive vision of the self-nature, as might be implied in the formula, see the nature and achieve Buddhahood. Rather, it involves the dynamic application of all the qualities revealed through that awakening in one's interaction with the world. The realization of the non-dual nature, which is the essential ground of sentient beings and Buddhas, exposes the two properties of that nature, the noumenal essence, which is the perfect, bright, and self-reliant foundation of the Dharmadhātu, and the phenomenal function which manifests objects in the sensory realms in all their diversity. It is through these two properties that the true nature exhibits itself throughout the world, and thus accomplishes the perfect, unimpeded interpenetration of all phenomena. The function of the self-nature is unimpeded during all activities and is never separate from the pure enlightened nature. Hence, if a student looks back on the radiance of that enlightened nature, falsity is extinguished, the mind's activities are cleansed, and the myriads of phenomena are illuminated and shown to be in dynamic interaction with each other. Consequently, the ultimate state of the interpenetration of all phenomena is not distinct from the fundamental wisdom inherent in the self-nature of all sentient beings. If that nature is recognized through Son practice, the ultimate goal of the Hwaåm school is realized. By the same token, Chinul countered the notion prevalent among many Son adepts that the scholastic sects, Hwaåm in particular, were simply involved in speculative philosophizing which had no bearing on actual practice. In encouragement to practice, Chinul shows that sudden awakening and cultivation are possible in the Hwaåm sect as well, and he states explicitly that Son adherents should never assume they have an exclusive claim on suddenness. Chinul points out elsewhere that the doctrinal explanations of Hwaåm are intended to prompt students toward the attainment of Buddhahood, just as in Son. The detailed analyses appearing in the scholastic descriptions, which disturbed the Son adherents who preferred terse explanations, were actually designed for sentient beings of lesser capacity. For those incapable of going beyond the judgments and guidance of the relative mind, such descriptions provide a conceptual framework for approaching practice and a realistic account of the results to be expected. This approach encourages people who are less familiar with spiritual matters to start out themselves in Buddhist practice. Eventually, these relative descriptions will have to be abandoned for a direct realization of the true nature. But this is not to deny their conventional utility at a particular stage in spiritual development. It should be clear that Son and the scholastic schools have their own propensities, but these are not, however, necessarily contradictory. Indeed, a combination of the theoretical and practical stances which characterize these major branches of Buddhism can often be the most effective means for promoting enlightenment in the majority of practitioners. In the final formulation of Chinul's own approach to Son, which was to become the standard for the Korean Son tradition as a whole, these two branches are synthesized into an approach which is of the widest possible application. Because most individuals of normal and inferior spiritual capacity require the help of scriptural instruction in order to prompt enlightenment, the descriptions of Dharma given in the Hotsa school and in Li Tung Xuan's exposition are used initially to clarify the absolute and relative aspects of the mind and the proper course of practice. Such an understanding gives the beginner a clear picture of the nature and purpose of Buddhist meditation. But the student cannot merely remain content with these conceptual descriptions, regardless of how strongly they encourage his cultivation. The student must learn to put that doctrine into practice and realize its validity directly. Once he understands the path of practice, he should abandon all relative descriptions of Dharma and enter upon the living road of Son practice, the way of Hwa-du investigation. It should not be assumed, however, that Chinul's syncretic stance compromises the practice orientation of the Korean Son schools. Even when engaged in the theoretical study considered essential for the average student, the aspirant has been steeped in the transcendent outlook of Son. Hence, the student remains aware of the original sublimity of the non-dual mind, from which the discriminative theories he studies all emerge. With this understanding, the student will not grasp at the conceptual form of theories and take them as ultimate, but will use them as guides, pointing always to their source, the mind. Finally, After he has studied the doctrine and realized through sown practice the highest expression of that doctrine, the unimpeded interpenetration of all phenomena, he will understand that after all, everything is simply the operation of the fundamental wisdom of his own self-nature. I will come back to this question in the discussion of Chinul's methods of practice.